one is always at risk when introducing a friend. Either forget to say anything because you know a lot and don't recognize that others may not know as much. But Paul George, director of the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, is no stranger to this group. He's spoken to us several times over the years. It seems to me like a lot. He's a fixture in the Peninsula area with the organization, heading the organization that is almost synonymous with concern for social justice in this area. He is known also as a radio personality with the weekly, it's not weekly, monthly interview program on the local television channel. The Peninsula Peace and Justice Center has one of the best websites around, peaceandjustice.org. It has a calendar that is a must check for what's going on in the area. Even run some humanist community programs. So you know it's good. It's a pleasure to present Paul, but I have another thing first. I was just coming in today wanting to make announcements. And the first one is about, particularly for some of you who live north of here, a program of the North Peninsula ACLU chapter. They're having a program on Thursday evening, and wouldn't you know, that topic is surveillance. The speaker is the head of the legal director of the the Freedom Electronic Frontier Foundation, the legal director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which many of you are familiar with. And there's flyers on the door and at the table there. On the next evening, you don't have to travel as far. The Peninsula Peace and Justice Center is sponsoring a program here in Palo Alto. It's also on the same topic. And the speaker is Robert Scheer, who's editor of the web site TruthDig. If you're not following TruthDig, you're missing a real opportunity for a collection of articles and information, again, about mostly peace and justice kinds of issues. And that's Friday evening at Lucy Stern. Right, oh, you're right. Okay, that was redundant, but it's on the chairs. It's in the green. Then on the 25th, the local chapter of the ACLU is having another program, same topic. And that's a dinner meeting, and there are flyers of that about as well. The one other, I wanted to recognize someone else before I get to Paul. Steffi Reeder, who is the, why don't you just stand up, Steffi, because somebody might want to talk to you afterwards if they don't know you. She's the president of the board of the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, and the one that keeps some of the rest of us who are also on that board in line and working on what we're supposed to be working on. I'm going to save a little bit of time for Paul George, so why don't I quit it right now? Paul George.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I want to thank Arthur and Martin for the invitation. I'm always happy to be back here at the Humanist Forum. I want to thank Brian for recording this, and I want to thank the NSA for recording it wherever you are. Soon to be available on nsa.gov website as well as the Humanist website. Let me start out by just reading you a little bit of 17th century prose. 18th century, I'm sorry. It's actually the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, the fourth article of the Bill of Rights, and it says, Even though it's in old language, I think it's pretty clear and straightforward, but good to remind ourselves as we start out on this topic. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That sounds pretty straightforward. Nothing, no collection of information or data, persons, houses, papers, effects shall be seized or searched without probable cause. And we're going to find out, I think you already know today, that that's not the case when it comes to the NSA and scooping up our information. I also want to mention at the outset that I'm going to limit my comments because this is such a huge and ever-growing scandal, basically. I mean, when I'm preparing to give a talk, you know, you need to keep up with current events. Well, talks like this get revised every morning because there's a new headline. This morning's New York Times, when I went out to the driveway to get it, the lead story is like a 3 full-page article about this burgeoning scandal and how massive the surveillance is that the NSA has undertaken. We don't have the time to get into all of it, but I think what is most essential and important, your visitor Mark mentioned this at the outset, is the surveillance of people who live here in the United States. People who fall under that Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. And so I'm going to limit my remarks during the talk to the domestic aspects of this. Angela Merkel can come back and she can give her own talk later, but we're going to talk about what's happening to us, the people of the United States who are supposed to be protected by the Bill of Rights, and in this situation by the Fourth Amendment in particular. I just want to mention, the first time I gave this talk was back in August. It was up in Marin, up in Mill Valley. And it happened to be the 50th anniversary of the famous March on Washington, led by Martin Luther King and all the leaders of the civil rights movement. And I noted at the time that every person who spoke from that stage, now this was an event that was being commemorated around this country, the 50th anniversary of this massive March on Washington for civil rights, and to follow the Constitution was one of the claims, was one of the demands of that march. Every single person who spoke from that stage in Washington, D.C. 50 years ago had been or was still under surveillance by the United States government. Every single speaker that day. Never got mentioned in the course of our commemoration of that great event. Something to keep in mind. That what we're seeing right now, this massive surveillance of U.S. citizens, is nothing new. Massive surveillance by the United States government is nothing new. It's something that has been engaged in throughout our history. If we are to confront it successfully now, we have to keep that in mind. That this is something that governments, and our government in particular, engages in routinely. And I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to spend some time talking about the history of U.S. government surveillance of ourselves and other people and how it has developed. And as you look at the history of it, I think you see two main elements that constantly drive surveillance forward. One, of course, is the constant advance of technology. And boy, have we seen that in the last 10, 20, 30 years. But technology in its various forms is always advancing. And what we find as we look at the history of surveillance is that often those who are surveilling us are the first ones to adopt some of the new technologies and apply it to surveillance. And the other thing that seems to go along with the history of surveillance and constantly ratcheting it up is the presence of a war mentality, a siege mentality, whether the country is actually at war or being constantly warned about these threatening enemies, such as with our current war on terror. So let's really roll back some history and take a quick, brief look at where our country has been in terms of surveillance. And for this, I'm going to start with America's first, what was considered America's first imperial adventure, the invasion and occupation of the Philippines in 1898. This is the first time the United States had sent troops overseas to seize and colonize another country. It led to the first anti-imperial actions and organizations in this country, most famously the Anti-Imperial League, founded by Mark Twain, one of our most revered writers. Anyway, 1898, the United States invaded and occupied and began colonizing the Philippines. But not long after the invasion, the U.S. occupiers faced a determined opposition that led to the first formal government surveillance systems. Now, they were using the latest in technology at the time. I just want to run through this quickly because I think it's really interesting, because technology is such an important part. At the time, these were all new technologies. There was the rapid telegraph, made possible by Thomas Edison's improvements to existing telegraph technology, and at the same time, the invention of Philo Remington's invention of the typewriter. The two went together to make communications a lot more rapid. Right around the same time, Melville Dewey created the Dewey Decimal System. This is alphanumeric coding, and it made possible the cataloging of huge amounts of data quickly and easily and clearly to everyone. And at the same time, the Gamewell Corporation improved police communications. You might have seen in really old movies, the local policeman on the beat would go up to a call box and could phone into headquarters. This became a major part of our surveillance system in the Philippines. And finally was the invention of photography, which had come a little earlier, but not much earlier. These four elements were breakthrough technologies at the time. We were at war, occupying the Philippines, facing a determined opposition, and the two came together to lead to this country's first major surveillance activities. All these technologies were combined under the brand new Army's Division of Military Information, under the command of one Captain Ralph Van Diemen. We're going to hear a lot more about Captain Ralph as we go on. This was the country's first intelligence agency. Soon the Army had compiled phenomenally detailed information on thousands and thousands of Filipinos, activists and non-activists alike, including their physical appearance, their personal finances, how much property they had, what their political loyalties were, and kinship networks. Kinship networks, keep that in mind. This is all the same thing, but it was 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. A couple of early signs of how intelligence would get used. The Associated Press's Manila bureau chief was reporting quite critically on the Army's occupation of the Philippines and what was happening there. Well, the Division of Army Information dug up a lot of dirt on this reporter, this would-be whistleblower, and fed it to other New York newspapers, ruined the guy's career. At the same time, they were digging up dirt on one of the leading Filipino politicians at the time, Manuel Quezon, who was a rising star in Filipino politics at the time, would later be president of the Philippines. But he was also an informant, a spy for the police in the Philippines. And so that dirt on him was never made public, just came out in the historic record much later. So we start to see that there's a lot more than anti-terrorism at play when the government is collecting surveillance or collecting data about us. That was the beginning. Then came World War I and the U.S. entry into the war in 1917. And at the time, after the Philippines, the Army Information Division had been shut down. The Army went into World War I, into Europe, with no intelligence division at all. But Captain, now Major General, Ralph Van Diemen, was brought back and called upon to recreate what he had done. And the new division was now called Military Intelligence Division, and using the methods he had pioneered in the Philippines. He also expanded the reach of military intelligence into the civilian realm by teaming up with the FBI to create the American Protective League, which had 350,000 citizen operatives spying on fellow citizens. In this case, German Americans. In just 14 months, the League compiled millions of pages of surveillance reports, the largest such operation in the world at the time. USA #1 leading the way. After the armistice in 1918, the Military Intelligence Division and the FBI continued their domestic surveillance practices, this time turning their focus on left-wing activists, labor union organizers, and other people like that. All of this was under President Woodrow Wilson. The overseas war and advances in technology come to an end, but the surveillance and collecting of information about possible political enemies continues. It's a lesson we need to keep in mind because it's deeply embedded in the government, whoever's in office. When Wilson left office, actually Republican reformers and privacy advocates dismantled these domestic intelligence operations. This is something else we'll see throughout history. When the surveillance is revealed, there's a lot of pushback by the American people and it becomes a popular thing. We're going to talk about that more before the end of the talk. At the time, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone was worried that, quote, a secret police may become a menace to free government, end quote. And he also announced that, quote, the Bureau of Investigation is not concerned with political or other opinions of individuals, end quote. And perhaps most famously from this period, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, when he closed the Military Intelligence Division's cipher section, said famously, quote, gentlemen do not read each other's mail, end quote. I guess we're out of gentlemen in the government currently. World War II drove the next phase of intelligence gathering. Starting in 1940, the FBI was put in charge of domestic intelligence and counterintelligence, and the Military Intelligence Division, back again, which would eventually morph into the CIA and the NSA, was put in charge of foreign intelligence, a division of responsibilities that lasts pretty much till today, with a lot of slop over into different areas. Throughout the war, the FBI used warrantless wiretaps, black bag break-ins, and surreptitious mail reading to track suspected German agents. The FBI also recruited 300,000 citizen informers to guard defense plants against sabotage threats that were ultimately considered negligible. In 1960, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests, as I alluded to at the beginning about the March on Washington, they led to the surveillance of those movements led to the next big leap in domestic surveillance, leading to the infamous program COINTELPRO, which was revealed for the first time by the fabulous New York Times journalist at the time, Seymour Hersh. This led to one of the first major congressional investigations into intelligence gathering activities, the Church Committee. Frank Church, senator, held an extraordinary series of special investigations into COINTELPRO after Seymour Hersh revealed it to the people, much like Edward Snowden has revealed the secrets to us today. I'm going to talk about the current investigations in a little while, but we don't have anything that approaches the effectiveness and thoroughness of Frank Church's Special Investigations Committee. They uncovered 2,370 COINTELPRO actions from 1960 to 1974. They had files on over 300,000 anti-war activists. Church called it, quote, a sophisticated intelligence operation that would be intolerable in a democratic society, even if all of the targets had been involved in violent activities, end quote. This is something we need to keep in mind, because the NSA, in responding to all these various allegations and revelations of Snowden and others, have been talking about, we've stopped 54 terrorist plots. By the way, you'll see that number 54 repeated by politician after politician, by bureaucrat after bureaucrat. There weren't 54 terrorist plots stopped. The number has been proved false, but the media keeps repeating it, the politicians keep repeating it. Even if it had stopped 54 terrorist plots, I think we would do well to keep in mind Senator Church's warning that such a sophisticated intelligence operation should be intolerable in a democratic society. Even if it is stopping 54 terrorist plots, you do not, in a democratic society, collect information on literally everybody in the country. So this led to, the Church Committee, in addition to other things, led to what's in the news a lot now, and that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which led to the FISA courts, these secret courts that review the NSA requests for surveillance authorization. And that brings us up to today. And again, that was in 1974 that the FISA Act first passed. So today we know we still have this massive covert intelligence gathering operation, and aimed a great deal at domestic targets, and in direct reaction to 9/11, the war on terror, and using the amazing technologies that have been developed in the past 20, 30, 40 years. So again, I'm going to restrict this survey to what's going on domestically, because I think that's the most important thing. It's something we all can and should have a say about. Whether they want to tap Angela Merkel's cell phone, that's something for the foreign policy community to talk about. When it comes to collecting our data, yours and mine, and our friends and coworkers and family, that's something we need to be concerned about and take to heart the Fourth Amendment. So what is it exactly that they're collecting? I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with it since it's been all over the news, but let's just run through it. Telephone metadata. They are collecting, thanks to Edward Snowden's revelations, we know that they're collecting what's called the telephone metadata. This includes the telephone numbers called, time, duration of the call, location of your cell phone if you're making a call from the cell phone. It's a lot of information like you would see on your phone bill when it comes in. It tells you when you made a call, or when you received a call, and where it was from and how long it lasted, and if you've gone over your minutes and are going to be billed a whole lot more. So a lot of politicians, Senator Dianne Feinstein in particular, and I will return to the unfortunate topic of Senator Feinstein later, have said that, you know, this isn't really surveillance, this is just collecting information so that we can go back and connect the dots if we need to connect the dots. I'm forgetting who it said, was if you're looking for a needle in the haystack, you need a haystack. So this is the haystack. They're collecting everything, and this is apparently on virtually anyone who uses a telephone in this country. Cell phone, landline, whatever. This information is being recorded. What can they do with this kind of information? What's it mean? I mean, it's on your phone bill, right? Well, with their computer technology, they can connect a whole lot of dots whenever they want. And in fact, a German activist, a member of the German Green Party, actually demonstrated what could be done. The guy's a computer programmer. In Germany, they collect pretty much the same information, but they don't store it as much as we do. We store it for 5 years, all this data, every telephone call. Germany keeps it a year. And the people in Germany have a right to see what their file is and what's in their file. So this German activist got his file, got all this metadata, and being a programmer, ran a program to connect the dots and showed that for over the course of 1 year, somebody doing this kind of intelligence analysis could have followed him around the country and known everything that he was doing in every place he went and where he slept for that entire year by putting all these little dots together. So that's the telephone metadata. Then there's the PRISM program. And this is internet content collected from large technology companies. What websites were visited. Who email was going to and from, online chats. And this one is interesting. This is coming from corporations. They're not tapping into anything. They're getting orders from the FISA court that says, Google or Yahoo or Facebook, you have to give us this information about your users. And this comes from Section 215 of the Patriot Act, that in tracking down so-called terrorists, that the government has the right to get business records. That's the term used in the Patriot Act, Section 215, business records. So companies like Google and Yahoo and Facebook, their business records contain a lot of personal data about you, even more so than the telephone metadata. So they don't have to, and the same is true of the telephone metadata. The government is not tapping anything. They get an order from the FISA court, like the Verizon court order that Edward Snowden revealed, and they go to Verizon or they go to Sprint or whoever, AT&T, and say, give us your business records. Not on this person or that person, all of them. They do the same thing with Google and Yahoo and Facebook and all the others. They get a court order, these are business records, we get them all. So that's PRISM. So the NSA collects and stores about 250 million internet communications each year. Most of that comes from the internet service providers. About 9% of it is collected directly off the internet by NSA spy programs. Some small portion of it is kind of wiretapping. But federal courts have recently found that the direct collection is indeed unconstitutional, what's called upstream collecting. So the numbers aren't released, but roughly, if it's, as the analysts say, 9% of the collections, and other reports say there's 250 million internet communications collected every year, the 9% that's unconstitutional is about 23 million constitutional violations every year by the NSA just in this upstream internet communication. So going back to this business records collection authorized under the Patriot Act. This is what's known as outside of the envelope data. And it goes way back to the FBI wanting to look at literal envelopes in the US mail. And the Supreme Court decided that when you put your return address on an envelope and you put an addressee's address on the front of the envelope and you drop it in a post office box, you've made it public information and it can be collected. That is the same logic, those Supreme Court rulings from ages ago that applied to paper mail, what we refer to as snail mail these days. That's the same logic that are applying to these other business records. When you pick up the phone and dial it, and you use AT&T to transfer your call, you've publicly given AT&T that phone number that you're calling, and you've given up all rights to keeping it secret. That's the logic and theory. Sonia Sotomayor, I think, is the only current Supreme Court justice that has directly addressed this, and she said we need to go back and re-examine this principle. So, one more program, and then we'll go on to the next step. Something called X-Key Score. collects almost everything from the internet that crosses international boundaries. Now, the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, is called that precisely because it was supposed to limit the NSA, and still applies supposedly to the NSA, to collecting just information from foreign countries. But what they do is, as long as it starts or ends up in a foreign country, NSA is saying, oh, well then it's okay for us to collect it. If it crosses an international boundary, if it runs through United States servers, or if it's an email addressed to somebody in the United States or vice versa to somebody outside of the United States, NSA is saying that's fine, we can collect that. That's within our purview, that's constitutional. They're collecting so much of this that they can only keep the data for a matter of days. There's just so much data being collected through the X-keyscore program of internet communications that they only have the capacity, the actual physical computer capacity, to store this data for a few days. So they have to run through it very quickly. Now, people try to get a handle on, well, how much is this data, you know? Well, officially it's over 20 terabytes per day. I don't know if terabyte means anything to you. A terabyte is 1 million bytes. Now, we all know that our text and our email are in little bytes and stuff. But let's put it in this manner. The Library of Congress has the biggest collection of books in the world, continues to add to it. Computer scientists have estimated that all the data collected and stored in the Library of Congress comes to 10 terabytes. The NSA is collecting twice that amount of data every day. 2 Libraries of Congress collected every day. So those are the essential domestic surveillance programs that are at play, that we know about so far from the Edward Snowden revelations. And we also know that they're doing more. They're tapping into the trans-ocean communications cables, listening in on foreign leaders' phone calls, you name it, tapping straight into Google's servers overseas and Yahoo's servers overseas. It's a long, long list. But again, we're going to concern ourselves with the domestic surveillance aspect of it. Now, there are some bills in Congress I'm going to talk about very, very soon. And there's going to be quite a bit of debate in Congress over what to do about all these revelations. Congress will do something because people are up in arms about it. We just had the first major march on Washington a couple of weekends ago. Thousands of people gathered to reclaim their privacy rights. There had never been a march like that before in Washington, D.C. So it is coming to a head, and Congress will be taking action. And you're going to hear a lot of debate. And within that debate, you're going to hear a lot of terms thrown around. So I'd like to give you a quick little lexicon so you'll understand the terminology being used when they have these debates. Now, you might think these are all pretty simple, straightforward words that everyone knows the definition of. You'd be wrong, because we're talking about the NSA and the federal government. So let's take the first one, surveillance. Simple word. I think we all have a sense of what surveillance is. The NSA says collecting telephone metadata is not surveillance. It's not surveillance, since they aren't listening to the phone calls. They're just collecting data. So when someone says the NSA is not involved in surveillance or surveillance of United States citizens, it basically means they are indeed surveilling United States citizens. Senator Dianne Feinstein has been probably the leading proponent in Congress of this attitude. Just last week in an op-ed in USA Today, she wrote that the collection of telephone metadata is not surveillance. She is a strong supporter of the program. So keep that in mind. When they say there's no surveillance going on, what they really mean to say, if they were speaking English, is there is surveillance of US citizens going on. Collect. They're collecting information. You might think the word collect has a pretty common definition. Again, you'd be wrong. Part of the law that created the NSA and defined its powers and limitations states that collection does not occur when the government acquires information. It's right in the law. Collection occurs only when some of that information is selected or tasked for further processing. So they're piling up all these massive amounts of data. But to their doublespeak, they aren't collecting data. That only happens when they look a little closer. So, again, as you listen to these debates, when the NSA claims they aren't collecting data, you can be sure that what they mean to say is they are collecting data. Term relevant might be relevant in the near future. The NSA's phone call tracking program is authorized under the Patriot Act, as I mentioned earlier. Section 215 of the Patriot Act allows the government to compel businesses to turn over records that are relevant to foreign intelligence operations. The NSA theory, apparently, is that everybody's phone records are relevant because anybody's phone records might become relevant sometime in the future. So they have been stretching the definition of relevance beyond the breaking point. So when they say that they are only collecting relevant information, you can probably be sure that that's not true. How about targeted information or targeted persons? The NSA says that under the PRISM program, it is only targeting foreigners and people outside of the United States. But PRISM data collection is clearly collecting data from US citizens if they are the ones sending an email or making a phone call or receiving an email or phone call from someone overseas. It's not accidental. They are a target because that's how the program works. If it crosses borders, they get both sides of the email conversation or telephone call. So they'll tell you they are not targeting United States citizens when in fact they are targeting United States citizens. Along these lines, they will tell you that there's incidental collection of information and data about US citizens. Because the targets of the NSA's data collection are foreigners outside the US claims that the collection of America's communications is incidental. It happens, mistakes happen. But the PRISM program is designed to collect data from domestic citizens, as I just mentioned. During the congressional debates that led to the FISA Amendment Act of 2008, this was an attempt to adjust FISA just 5 years ago. And it was the Amendment Act in 2008 that NSA claims authorized the PRISM program. Intelligence officials openly testified that Americans' communications were of the most interest to them. They testified in Congress when they were writing the law that it was our communications that were of most interest. Legislators tried to introduce amendments that would have clearly barred this kind of data collection without a search warrant. President Bush threatened to veto the legislation. And so the amendments weren't applied, and the FISA Act passed and let through this incidental targeting of American citizens. One of the sponsors of one of the failed amendments that would have barred this kind of collection, by the way, was then Senator Barack Obama. Another term you're going to hear a lot is inadvertent. This is very similar to incidental. There's a lot of bureaucraties that you're going to be hearing. The NSA claims that wholly domestic email and phone calls that don't cross borders are sometimes collected inadvertently. Completely domestic communications, all of it, the text, your phone calls are collected inadvertently. But again, the very design of PRISM makes sure that purely domestic data collection, it's perfectly predictable the way the system is designed. They know that they're going to collect perfectly, completely domestic communications. But when it comes to talking to the media or to the American people, it's inadvertent. And finally, the last definition you'll need to understand is a very simple word that I think we all thought we understood, but apparently don't. That's the word no. When the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, was asked at a congressional hearing if the NSA was collecting information about millions of Americans, he answered no, and paused briefly and then added, not wittingly. He later conceded that he had been trying to be, quote, the least untruthful he could be. So when you hear no, they mean yes. So what do we do about all this? Well, as I've mentioned, there is movement now in Congress, and this is where I want to end up, because it's very important. This is going to be a critical debate that will set the boundaries of our own privacy, our secure communications for years to come. One thing about the FISA Act, this outside of the envelope Supreme Court decisions, a lot of the law, especially the things that have been through the Supreme Court, were all decided long before there were even PCs, let alone the internet and smartphones and all the other stuff that we have. So it's very out of date. The NSA is using all these loopholes and the leaps in technology to collect these masses of data. So in Congress right now, we have two major bills that have been introduced, and they are going to be fighting each other at loggerheads. The first one, which was just passed this past week by the Senate Intelligence Committee, chaired by our own Senator Dianne Feinstein. It's called the FISA Improvements Act. Senator Feinstein wrote this bill, introduced it as chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and will be taking it to the floor of the Senate and then over to the House of Representatives. And far from, if you want to call this a FISA Improvement Act, you'd have to ask Senator Feinstein who it's an improvement for. It's an improvement for the NSA, because this metadata telephone collection, for example, done under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, this collection of data that Senator Feinstein says does not constitute surveillance of U.S. citizens, her bill amends the Patriot Act to specifically authorize this and legalize it and institutionalize it and entrench it in the law. That's how she's going to take care of the problem of this massive collection of our telephone data. She's going to legalize it and make it clear, in case there was any question, that it's legal. It's one of the most dangerous things I've ever seen any senator come up with, let alone our own senator from California. She needs to hear from you on this. Her bill doesn't address any of the other revelations that have been brought up by Edward Snowden's revelations, including getting the records from Google and Yahoo, let alone hacking into Google and Yahoo, as we've just learned in the past week. There are a couple of good things in here, in her bill, that should be included in anything moving forward, one of which would be allowing the FISA court to hear amicus briefs. These are friends of the court. Right now, when the NSA goes to the FISA court to get authorization for some surveillance, there's nobody on the other side. Normally in American courts, you have two sides. You have a prosecution and you have a defense. When the NSA goes to the FISA court, there's nobody else on the other side saying, excuse me, FISA court, but this is a little out of hand. This is a little too much to get all the records from Verizon. So she's going to, her bill and the other bill that I'm going to talk about, both allow for some kind of advocate, public advocate, to appear before the FISA court. That's an important thing and should be supported. And Feinstein's bill and the other one I'm about to talk about also require that the FISA court send a summary of their opinions to Congress every year. Right now we have no idea what decisions they're being made, what logic it's based on. Now these are not, we still don't get to see the actual decisions or the logic, but it's a summary of the decisions. It's a step forward. It's a pretty weak step forward. But reforming the FISA court is going to be an important part of this. On the other part, in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, another bill has been introduced by Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And on the House side, it's being sponsored by Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, a Republican from Wisconsin. And Sensenbrenner being on this bill is very interesting because Jim Sensenbrenner was the author of the Patriot Act. And he's the one that says Section 215 was not intended to authorize the massive collection of data about United States citizens. They're abusing it. This is not what we meant. So he and Leahy have introduced the bill. On the House side, it's called H.R. 3361, officially is the number. And on the Senate side, it's S. 1599. And it's called the USA Freedom Act, to kind of juxtapose itself to the USA Patriot Act. USA Freedom Act, I love these, I'm going to take a moment, actually stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Fulfilling Rights and Ending Eavesdropping. Anyway, it's a good bill and it should be supported. This would require that if they're going to collect this telephone metadata or anything else on a U.S. citizen, that A, there has to be an ongoing and credible terrorist investigation to collect anything, and that the U.S. citizen being targeted is logically considered part of it. The bill would clearly end all this massive scooping up of the data. It's really what we need. It's what the American people, some 70 or 74%. Americans aren't very united in a lot of political opinions right now. But this is one area, the massive collection of our own personal private data, that's really brought us together. I think the latest poll I saw was 74% oppose what the NSA is doing with this data collection on American citizens. So it would require that, quote, tangible things, as it says in the bill, sought through data collection are, quote, relevant and material to an authorized investigation into international terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities, end quote. The data collection would also have to pertain to a particular foreign power or its agents. And it would require a court order to search for any American's communications in data collected overseas. And it would also restrict what's called reverse targeting. We found out through Edward Snowden that a lot of US citizens are indeed the targets, so the official target by the NSA is someone in a foreign country who's emailing someone here. And it's called reverse targeting. They go to the FISA court and say, we want to target this person in Germany, when the real target is in Boulder, Colorado. So the Leahy-Sensenbrenner USA Freedom Act needs to be deeply supported. One of the ways that that bill is going to get to the Senate floor and the House floor, as with many bills, is to have show a lot of support among representatives and senators for that bill. The Leahy-Sensenbrenner USA Freedom Act currently has slightly over 100 co-sponsors. In the House, it has 86 co-sponsors, and I'm very happy to tell you this morning that all our local congressional representatives are on as co-sponsors. Jackie Spear, Anna Eshoo, Mike Honda, and Zoe Lofgren have all co-sponsored the bill already. Over in the Senate, obviously, Senator Feinstein is not co-sponsoring the bill because she supports what the NSA is doing. That's why she's put forward her bill that would write into law what they're already doing. It's not reform at all. So for us as California residents, I would say we really need to get on Barbara Boxer's case to become a co-sponsor of the USA Freedom Act. I've got a quick petition here this morning that we'll send off to Boxer. We'll be putting it online soon. So let's try to get her signed onto this and advance this bill and get it onto the Senate floor. So let me just start that around, and while we do the Q&A, keep passing that around. So that's some legislation that we need to support. We need to, through this process, demand a really thorough debate. None of the ongoing investigations, the President's Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the Clapper investigation, the President, when he announced the investigation, said it'll be outside experts. It's not. It's being run by the head of the NSA with all Washington insiders, supposedly investigating Washington insiders. And the Senate Intelligence Committee under Dianne Feinstein has utterly failed to actually carry out an investigation. So we need a new church committee like we had back in 1974. And that will come from political pressure and demand from people like you and me and all the other average Joes and Janes out there. Take a moment to call Congress, even though Anna Eshoo has signed on to this bill. Call her up or send her an email and thank her and tell her to push it forward. That's the kind of thing that will get this done. And finally, we need to repeal some stuff, like the Patriot Act. Like the Patriot Act. It can't be rewritten. It was written in the wake of 9/11. It's a poorly crafted bill. It gives far too much authority to the government to engage in this kind of domestic surveillance. It should be repealed and everything rewritten so that we are just focusing our intelligence on stopping attacks against this country. Nobody argues against that. It's the collection of the domestic stuff. And finally, all of this, at the bottom of the Patriot Act and all this data collection is the war on terror. And everything from the data collection, domestic surveillance, siphoning up everything on the internet, to drone strikes in Pakistan and Somalia and Yemen is all based on the original authorization for the use of military force that authorized the US invasion of Afghanistan 12 years ago in 2001. That bill is still in effect, and it still drives our national surveillance and constant warfare state. It is time for Congress to go back and repeal that. We are no longer at war. It's time to put an end to the war on terror and all the abuses of our rights and liberties that war has resulted in. So let's do some questions and answers. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Paul. So Sandy to my right here will take note of hands and I'll follow her direction.
Yes, as we all know, we've seen speeches by Barack Obama as late as 2007 opposing the NSA surveillance. I was wondering what your thoughts were, about, what caused him to go over to the dark side. Did he, get blackmailed, or was he always that way and hoping change was just a bunch of crock, Oh, and also, what about Nancy Pelosi? She's been, on Obama's side pro NSA. You haven't mentioned her.
No, I didn't mention Nancy Pelosi because in her particular position as House Minority Leader, she wouldn't be introducing bills or signing on as a co-sponsor at this point. We would hope that her role will be that if, like the Sensenbrenner bill comes up for a vote in the House, that she won't insist that the Democratic representatives in Congress follow the administration line. And we don't know what they're going to do. In terms of Barack Obama, I can't speak to motivations or what happened. I do know that it's probably the single most disappointing thing about his administration, for me personally, because one of the reasons I voted for him was the civil liberties issue and the abuses of the Bush administration and the Patriot Act, and the fact that he put forward these amendments to stop this data collection while he was in the Senate. What happened in the meantime, I don't know. We can only speculate that he gets into the presidential bubble, the famous bubble, and he is being presented nightmare scenarios 24/7, 365 days a year by the NSA because they want to justify what they're doing. We don't know, and I don't think it's important to speculate. The important thing is for us to work with our elected representatives to change the law and insist that he follow that law. The other thing is he is a constitutional lawyer, and he looks at the Supreme Court decision that says outside of the envelope data collection is okay. That's why we need to go back and change the law and revisit these Supreme Court decisions, because it's being said that it's constitutional right now. The Supreme Court has signed off on it. It's a big problem. Just like the problem with, Citizens United and campaign finance. When the Supreme Court says it's all right, there's not much Congress can do to overturn that. So that's why we need to focus on getting these laws repealed, at the very least amended. In terms of the foreign intelligence gathering, like the Angela Merkel and other people being tapped, there's some evidence apparently that he was not told about this. That the NSA, and I think this is becoming clearer about the extent of the program, is that they're not clearing this with anybody. They're just doing it because they can. I mean, they are collecting information that no reasonable person would think would be necessary to collect. But they're doing it and bragging about it in their internal documents about their accomplishments. This is some of the most recent stuff that came out from the Snowden documents when the German Chancellor's cell phone information was released. That, they were listing things on their weekly briefing that, hey, we did this, we got Ban Ki-moon's cell phone, and we got these talking points and all this stuff. So, who knows? There's tens of thousands of documents that still haven't been released. Who knows what we're going to find out? Maybe we'll find out that Obama knew every single bit. Maybe we'll find out that he didn't know any of it, or that he authorized it. I don't know. Yeah.
This Patriotic Act and the surveillance programs were created to prevent terrorist attacks, which I feel is a good thing.
Yes.
To avoid the killing of hundreds of people, Obviously, it got out of control, and now they are using it for some other purposes.
Right.
My little naive question is, are there proofs or examples that this excess of control has harmed some people or has favored some private interests or corporation interests that makes them unacceptable?
Well, there have been some documented cases of actual harm, because it's been revealed, for example, that some of these illegal wiretaps and data collection and things like that have been turned over to other agencies like the Drug Enforcement Administration. And the information has actually been used in prosecutions. And the DEA gets this illegally obtained information from the NSA, builds a case against a defendant, and then when they turn it over to the prosecutor, the district attorney or whoever is going to bring these charges, and the DA looks at it and says, well, where did you get this information? They're lying to him about where it came from, because if they told him that it was from illegal wiretapping or illegal data collection, that case could never go to court. So that's one documented case where even our justice system has been subverted by this massive intelligence operation. So we know it's going beyond the NSA. It's in the Snowden documents that it's gone to the DEA, and we have prosecutors complaining that they've actually discovered, after taking a case to court, that this was illegally obtained information that started with the NSA, got passed off to the DEA. That's one little peek under the covers that we've seen, where the NSA data is going way beyond the confines of the NSA building. We don't know where else it might be going. And that's the real danger, is that we know that when this amount of intelligence is collected, the potential for abuse is tremendous, because we've seen it in our past, time and time again. Whether it was COINTELPRO in the 1970s, or the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s, or the Red Scare of the 1930s, this sort of domestic intelligence collection has been used to directly harm innocent citizens. What the current scope and scale of it is, we can only imagine, but we have to know that it's going far beyond the NSA, far beyond anti-terror activities. Where else? Okay?
I have two questions. The first concerns the soothing words that we hear about the collection of metadata is on telephone calls, which is only required to connect the dots. I'd suggest that connecting the dots is just the first step, and that the obvious second step is then to ask what was the content of the calls that were made between parties that you regard as suspicious. So my question is, are you confident, or do you believe that the metadata collection of telephone calls is actually all that is being collected, or under these circumstances do you think the content is also being collected but they're not talking about it? Second question, while I've got the opportunity, I'm personally much more concerned about the collection of data by US corporations than by the NSA. And the reason for that is that I'm virtually certain that the data being collected by social media corporations is going to be used to target me with adverts, among other reasons, whereas what I'm saying and writing, I think, is of no interest to the NSA. So, with regard to the Fourth Amendment, as you read it, I didn't hear you say surveillance by the government, although that may be implied by a preamble. So my question is, could the Fourth Amendment be invoked to constrain the collection of data by US corporations as being unwarranted surveillance?
That's an excellent question. I don't know particularly if the Fourth Amendment directly could be used to restrict the collection of our personal data from corporations. I do know what we need on the internet right now is a much stronger privacy protections. That so-called internet tracking be a thoroughly opt-in situation rather than, we don't even have an opt-out. You know, some browsers have a do not track thing. Nobody's required to follow that or anything. The idea of corporations collecting this data, this is an important concept. Now, we all know that places like Google and Facebook and Yahoo do track our movements on the web. They look at things you want to buy, and then you start seeing ads for those things showing up, right? That's where we should be able to say, I want you to stop doing that. Or better, I will allow you to do that. The default position is you can't do that. That's why I say opt-in. But to a certain extent, we voluntarily do that. We don't bother with opting out. We don't read the terms and conditions that run to 50 pages. When we click yes, we're at a new website and stuff. And part of that is actually beneficial. You know, you might end up seeing ads for things that you're interested in instead of ads for things you have no interest in. Where the danger of this kind of data collection comes in is that Google amasses all this, you know, tracking you as you move around the web. Then the NSA comes to Google via the FISA court and says, under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, we can get your business records. Give us that data. So what you might have actually opted into voluntarily because you want the benefits of Google having a sense of, you know, how to set up the internet for you and make surfing easier and find search results that are more meaningful to you. While you may, you know, allow Google to do that, you're not realizing that you're saying, and the NSA can have all this information as well. But under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, where they can get access to these business records, they can get all that data too. Also, in terms of corporations, I would not be at all surprised that some of the leakage from the NSA, like is going to the Drug Enforcement Administration, is also going to corporations. One of the biggest, you know, intelligence gathering operations is, you know, corporate espionage, trying to stay ahead of each other. And finally, your first question about am I confident that they're only collecting metadata versus the actual content? Absolutely, I'm not confident that it's restricted to that. We know they're collecting content through the PRISM and the X keystroke programs on the internet. And we know that they're collecting the metadata. I am not at all confident that we've seen the end of the story. Like I said, there's thousands more documents that haven't even been gone through that Snowden released to the Guardian newspaper and the New York Times and the Washington Post. They're still going through these documents. There's a lot more to learn, and I think we're only going to continue to be shocked and outraged, I hope. And we'll continue to take action on these issues.